Entrando em contato com atendimento ao cliente... Para muitas pessoas é um jeito fácil de arruinar um bom dia. Mas na Zendesk, nós deixamos a experiência do cliente melhor. Melhor para sua avó, melhor para o seu vendedor preferido de flores, melhor para o cara do apartamento 3A, melhor para você, melhor para todos. Porque enquanto alguns dizem que o cliente sempre tem razão, nós dizemos que o cliente é sempre humano. E, como seres humanos, queremos fazer algo melhor para todos nós. Zendesk, experiência do cliente com IA desenvolvida para humanos.
Hello and welcome to the 6th episode in our 15 Fictions for Summer series. This is part 2 of me talking about my favourite novel, George Eliot's Middlemarch. I finished the last episode talking about Dorothea and Casaubon and their terrible marriage and Casaubon's death. Casaubon is by no means the sole or even prime representative of Christianity in this book. There are many Christians, many different kinds of Christians, many different kinds of believers, and in fact, different kinds of clergymen too. There's another reverend in Middlemarch, a slightly more minor character, but he crops up quite a lot. And he is, in many ways, Casaubon's antithesis. He's called the Reverend Camden Fairbrother. Some of the characters in this novel have slightly weird Christian names. So Camden Fairbrother. And he is not death. He is life. He is a deeply sympathetic character. I think a lot of people who read the book really warm to him. He is kind. He is energetic. He lives life to the full. So even though he's a reverend, he's a clergyman, he's also very social, unlike Casaubon, who really isn't. He's a gambler. He plays whist for money quite well, successfully. He's not a careless cavalier gambler. He's a shrewd gambler. He wants to supplement his meager living. But what he isn't is much of a clergyman. Apparently his sermons are quite popular, partly because they're not particularly religious. They're just homilies about some home truths, sort of life advice. But we know he's not much of a clergyman because he thinks he's not much of a clergyman. He has doubts. We don't really hear much about the doubts that he might have about his faith, although I think it's implicit. But he definitely has doubts about whether he should be a clergyman. It's his profession. Men like him have to make a living somehow. And in late 1820s, early 1830s England, the church was one of the main professions. In fact, often it was the default option. And it's what he fell into. He's quite good at it in a way, although it doesn't seem to have much career advancement built into it. He's not really going anywhere until, through his own charm, but also good fortune, he inherits Casaubon's vicarage, thanks to Dorothea. Dorothea makes Fairbrother the new Casaubon. And this is good news not just for the parishioners who don't have to listen to Casaubon's sermons, but it's also good news for Fairbrother because it's much better paid. And actually he can look after his mother and his sister who depend on him for a living. He's a very worldly clergyman. At one or two points in the book, he confides to friends that he thinks he should probably have been a scientist, that that's where his vocation lies. The one thing he doesn't seem to have is a vocation for the church. He suspects that he's slightly ridiculous as a clergyman, but he is a good person. He is a Christian. It's not like Christianity in this book is represented by Casaubon, the antithesis of life. It's also represented by Fairbrother, who is a life well lived. He's friends with another significant character in the book, a younger man. Fairbrother is closer to Casaubon's age, a man who's closer to Dorothea's age called Fred Vincy, who is also a very likable character, full of life, full of energy. He's not a particularly steady young man. He does lots of things that turn out to have unfortunate consequences for him and the people around him, so he gets into debt. He is also a gambler, but he's not a steady gambler. He's a frivolous gambler, and actually he can't control his own gambling. And he can't settle to a career. he keeps changing his mind about what he wants to do. And secretly, actually, what he hopes he's going to do is inherit money and not have to have a job. But actually, in that, he's disappointed. So he's a frustrated young man. But his redeeming characteristic is that he is very steady in love. He loves a young woman called Mary Garth, who is socially thought to be a bit beneath him, certainly by his family. Unfortunately, not so much for him, but definitely for Camden Fairbrother. Fairbrother also is in love with Mary Garth. But Fairbrother's a good man, and he understands that Mary almost certainly loves Fred and not him, and he tries to reconcile himself to this. At one point, Fred asks Fairbrother to be his kind of intermediary and go to Mary and say to Mary, Fred knows he's a bit hopeless. Will you stick with him? Because he's got to make a life decision. He still wants to marry you, but he's got to make a life decision, and he knows he needs a career, and his family are pressing him to go into the church, and he could do that. He's taking a degree, and he's a reasonably well-educated young man, just not very good at settling to anything. What do you feel about the thought of Fred becoming a clergyman? And Mary, via the clergyman, the Reverend Fairbrother, passes back the message to the would-be clergyman, Fred Vincey. If you go into the church, I will not marry you. The one thing I will not marry is you as a clergyman, because it would be ridiculous. You would be ridiculous. You would make a mockery of the profession that you'd chosen. And I'm not going to marry a ridiculous man. It's a very powerful message. And Fred listens to it, and he becomes a property surveyor. The Reverend Fairbrother also performs in this novel one of the acts of near saintly virtue, one of the genuinely, clearly moral acts in the book, heroic morality, on a very small scale, involving personal relationships and involving love, because he loves Mary too. And he knows that Mary will only marry Fred if Fred does settle to something. She won't marry him if he does something ridiculous, like become a vicar. But she also won't marry him if he doesn't do anything serious and just fritters his life away. And Fred keeps trying to settle to something, but he's tempted. He's easily tempted by, among other things, billiards and gambling on billiards. There's a billiard hall in town in Middlemarch where young men and not so young men congregate and they play for money. And Fred is always making resolutions to steer clear, and he manages to steer clear for long periods of time. He's quite good at sticking to his resolutions until he isn't, like everyone. And he drifts back to the billiard hall. And the Reverend Fairbrother also occasionally hangs out in the billiard hall, but in a much more controlled, mature clergyman kind of way. And he sees Fred gambling. And he knows that if Fred goes down that path, Mary will eventually abandon him. And he can see that Fred is back on that path. And Fred really doesn't have it within himself to steady himself. And so Fairbrother faces a choice. He could let Fred go down that path. And almost certainly that will be the end of his relationship with Mary. And Fairbrother knows that Mary likes him too. And he's got a chance with Mary, for sure. If Fred wasn't there, Mary would almost certainly marry Fairbrother, because Fairbrother may think he's ridiculous as a clergyman, but he's not. He's a respectable guy and he's a good guy. And so he can, through doing nothing, allow Fred to reveal his true character to Mary. And he may then win the heart of the woman that he loves. Or he could say to Fred, you're going to lose Mary if you go back to that billiard hall. The only way you are going to finally be able to marry her is if you see this as your last chance. And he chooses the second option. He says to Fred, who is terrified that what Fairbrother is actually going to do is go to Mary and say, I saw Fred, he's back in the billiard hall, marry me. And Fred's convinced this is what's going to happen. I don't think we're meant to think Fairbrother would ever do that, but he could certainly have done nothing. Instead of which, he gives Fred the only talking to in Fred's life that actually works, that actually delivers results, because this is the one time that Fred finally comes to understand, and I think by implication, because in some almost unspoken part of himself, he knows what it costs Fairbrother to do this. He recognizes the heroism of the sacrifice, and it is a heroic sacrifice. When Fairbrother says to him, this is your last chance, he takes it, and he doesn't carry on gambling, and in the end, he wins Mary, and Fairbrother loses her, and Fairbrother loses her because of that conversation. And George Eliot gives us to understand that this is a deeply moral moment. And Fairbrother is a good person. I'm sure this is the kind of thing that made Nietzsche want to puke. But the one thing that you could not say about Fairbrother or about the way that George Eliot describes that encounter is that it's moralistic. Because one of the things that's really striking about it is Fairbrother himself doesn't really understand why he's doing it. So he is not doing it because he thinks he's a good person. He doesn't think he's a particularly good person, which is maybe one of the preconditions of being good. He's certainly not doing it for religious reasons. He's not doing it for anything like doctrinal reasons or to do with some code, some moral code of honesty or truthfulness or anything like that. He surprises himself when he does it. And until he does it, he doesn't know what he's going to do. It sort of comes out of him. And afterwards, he tries to rationalize it. So afterwards, he can tell himself a story about why he did it, which is not a religious story and is not even particularly a moralistic or moralizing story, though it's at some level a moral story. He thinks that if he genuinely loves Mary, he must care about her happiness. It's the sort of story that disappointed lovers might tell themselves when they lose out to a rival whom they know their beloved truly loves, which is, actually what I want is her happiness, and I suspect that in the end she would be happier with a reformed Fred than with me. She would be unhappier with an unreformed Fred than with me, but though I could have allowed that to happen, that would not be her highest happiness. The ranking is reformed Fred first, me second, unreformed Fred third. Right, so reformed Fred is still number one for her. That's what I'm going to try and engineer for her. But it is a post hoc rationalization. And actually, the impression that one is left with of this act of moral heroism is that it's a kind of accident. It's an accident that comes out of the way that human beings relate to one another so that they never quite know what it is that they're going to do next. The one thing it is not is moralistic. If it's close to a philosophy, it is close to the philosophy of the philosopher who was probably the most profound influence on George Eliot's own philosophy, the Enlightenment Jewish Dutch philosopher Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, a complicated, profound, but sometimes impenetrable philosopher who had an understanding of morality, which is that it came out of lived human experience. It is not something that comes from the outside. It is not doctrinal in that sense. If it is religious, the religion is not the religion of revealed truth. It is the religion that emerges from the truth of life as it is lived. And if this moment, this moral moment, is made moral by the fact that it comes out of a lived life, it is constructed in the moment that it happens. It's not Nietzsche, it's Spinoza. It's definitely not moralizing. There is in Middlemarch a very moralistic character, who is also probably the most Christian character in the book, in the sense this is the person for whom Christianity is absolutely central to his whole sense of who he is. He is dogmatic and doctrinal. He is a believer for whom faith absolutely is following a moral code. The code is everything to him. He is not a clergyman. He is not a reverend, but he is a lay preacher. He is not an Anglican. He is a Methodist. He's a dissenter. And he's also a businessman. He's a banker. He is the town banker in a way. He is probably the most important person in the town. He's not the mayor. The mayor actually is the father of Fred Vincy. But Bulstrode is the man. Nicholas Bulstrode, banker, lay preacher, moralizer. He has his fingers in all sorts of pies. Many people in the town are beholden to him. Quite a few people are in debt to him. He is a banker. He is also behind many projects in the town, business projects. He funds this thriving, vibrant manufacturing town, but also charitable projects. The book opens in an early sequence with an extended passage about Bulstrode's plan to fund the hospital. This is the hospital which is going to have to take the cholera patients. It reappears at the end in that light. Bulstrode is the funder of the hospital. He is also the driving force behind the hospital, and he wants to control the hospital to make sure that it is a site of moral Christian virtue. So there is a fight early on about who's going to be the chaplain, and Bulstrode is determined that it's not going to be Fairbrother, a flighty Anglican, non-vocational vicar. He wants it to be one of his kind, a fire and brimstone preacher. In the view of the town, there is a word for Bulstrode. The town, Middlemarch, the people, think he's a hypocrite. They look at him, they look at this man who is puritanical, who frowns on blaspheming and gambling and drinking and pleasure, a pleasureless Christian, who is moralizing, who is always telling people what he thinks they ought to do in the eyes of God, whose sermons are not like Fairbrother's sermons, which are life lessons. They are threats of damnation. And yet he's also a banker. He is a banker. And he's a greedy man. He's obsessed with money. He's thought in the town to drive a really hard bargain. He's exploitative. And seen from the outside, it is very hard for the people who have to live in a town dominated by a man like that to believe that he's sincere. He looks like that classic type in which there is an outward show of virtue, but underneath it, what you have is the grasping businessman. But I think there are two more things to be said about Bulstrode than just he is a hypocrite. One is that he is also a classic type of Nietzschean Christian. The other type, not the Casaubon type, the negation of life. Bulstrode is full of life. He's full of energy. He's old. He's one of the oldest characters in the book. He's probably in his 60s, so good 20 years older than Fairbrother, who's 20 years older than some of the other characters. He's lived a full life. He's built a fortune. You don't build a fortune by just being Casaubon-like. You really have to go out in the world and make your way. He's full of life. He's full of energy. He's also full of a will, a drive to power. But as Nietzsche understood, Christianity doesn't just exist in the world as a dead hand stifling the human capacity to express power and therefore is embraced by the powerless. It can also be embraced by the powerful, because in a Christian world, if you can make use of Christian doctrine, it can become an extraordinarily useful vehicle for imposing yourself on other human beings to dominate. You can dominate through Christianity. Christianity, after all, has created extraordinarily hierarchical social structures. It has given certain human beings astonishing power, life and death power. Bulstrode doesn't quite have life and death power, but my God, if you owe him money, it feels like he does. He is a dominating personality. He is the dominating Christian type. But he is also the ascetic, the self-denier, and he uses self-denial, self-abnegation as an expression of his will to power. He is the example of what Nietzsche called the ascetic priestly caste, the people who recognize that one of the things that you can do with religion is set yourself apart from other people by living up to standards that are too demanding for most people, and then turning that into a structure of social domination. So you require those standards of everyone, and because you are the one who's living up to them, because they are standards of self-denial, actually what it gives you is control over other human beings. Bulstrode is that type of Christian. And I think George Eliot sees it in something like those terms, though I should emphasize at this point, by the time she's writing Middlemarch, she hasn't read Nietzsche. Nietzsche eventually will read her. She hasn't read Nietzsche, but she has read a lot of German philosophy. I think she sees Bulstrode in those terms, but she also writes about him profoundly sympathetically. He's a terrible person in many ways. I mean, a really awful person in a completely different way from Casaubon. But he is portrayed in the round, as Casaubon is, but more in the round than Casaubon, because there is more of him to go around. And George Eliot is very clear that she does not agree with her characters. She appears in this novel as the all-seeing, omniscient narrator at various points to comment on the characters that she has created who have a life of their own, but about whom she then expresses reservations or doubts, or explains what it is that is driving them. Of Bulstrode, she says, he isn't a hypocrite. They think he is, and it looks like he is, but she thinks he isn't. And after all, She created him. She thinks that Bulstrode is actually sincere in his faith. He really believes this stuff. And over the course of his long life, what he has done is squared, as she puts it, his desires with his doctrines. So both of them can be genuine. He has a desire in the world to make money and to dominate, but he also believes in the faith that he professes. And the way he squares them is that he tells himself that his success in the world is a sign that he is an instrument of God's will. And the more successful that he is, the more he is able to, in the world, profess the faith on which the salvation of the world depends. And he believes in that faith. And the more successful he is, the more he believes in it. And also at the back of his mind, he has a thought, which is the more he believes in it, the more successful he is. George Eliot says you should not call that hypocrisy unless you want to call everything in the world hypocrisy, because it is also sincerity. It is sincere faith. And Bulstrode is a believer. Probably in this book, he is the most sincere believer, more sincere than Casaubon, who I don't think in the end has any idea what he believes. Certainly more sincere than Fairbrother, though Fairbrother's sincerity is that he sincerely understands his own doubts. But Bulstrode just believes. And it's his belief that is his undoing in the end, not his hypocrisy. If Bulstrode was the character that the other characters in the book think he is, his end wouldn't be the terrible end that it is, that I'm about to describe, because he would be more devious, more manipulative, better able to adjust his behavior, because it wouldn't matter that it didn't match up to his faith. Because his faith is just for show. For the hypocrite, the faith is just the public performance behind which the real action is taking place. For Bulstrode, the sincerity of his faith depends on him being able to reconcile worldly success with a kind of puritanical profession of the true faith. What undoes him in the end is he genuinely has scruples. So it turns out that Bulstrode is a bad man, in the sense that he has done a bad thing deep in his past. Bulstrode's backstory is he's a self-made man. He starts out as a lay preacher. I think it's in Highbury in North London, but it also gives him social connections. By a circuitous route, Bulstrode ends up marrying a wealthy widow. But it turns out that this widow had a daughter, and her fortune is built on borderline criminal practices. It turns out that the fortune that Bulstrode inherits, and knowingly inherits, he totally knows its source because he worked in the business, is basically fencing for criminal goods. Criminals take their goods to Bulstrode's firm and he looks after them. It's a pawnbrokers, but it's a criminal pawnbrokers. And the daughter of the widow has left in disgust when she discovered how the family money was made. It's a convoluted plot. What happens is that the woman that he's going to marry will leave her money to Bulstrode, but only if he can assure her that her daughter is gone. That is, that her daughter is dead. No one knows what's happened to the daughter. He doesn't inherit if the daughter is alive. So he promises to this woman that he will try and find the daughter and let her know if the daughter is alive or not. Now, a true hypocrite would not even search, would pretend to look for the daughter, come back, say, I'm afraid there's no sign of her, I inherit.
Entrando em contato com atendimento ao cliente. Para muitas pessoas é um jeito fácil de arruinar um bom dia. Mas na Zendesk, nós deixamos a experiência do cliente melhor. Melhor para sua avó, melhor para o seu vendedor preferido de flores, melhor para o cara do apartamento 3A, melhor para você, melhor para todos. Porque enquanto alguns dizem que o cliente sempre tem razão, nós dizemos que o cliente é sempre humano. E como seres humanos, queremos fazer algo melhor para todos nós. Zendesk, experiência do cliente com IA desenvolvida para humanos.
He searches for her because he can't not. Part of him is unable to do the truly hypocritical thing. And he finds her, and he finds that she's still alive. And then he does the wicked thing, which is he tells this woman that her daughter is dead. And so he inherits. But there's one man involved in the search who knows the truth. And Bulstrode's deepest, darkest secret is only known by this other man. And he assumes this man has gone from his life because he paid him off. And in classic Victorian fiction style, this man, who is slightly cheesily named Raffles, reappears old, drunk, mean, desperate, and full of blackmailing malice. He returns to Bulstrode and says, you better pay me off, because you do not want the people in this town to know the basis of your fortune. The twin bases of your fortune, one of which it's criminal proceeds, the second of which is that you inherited it by telling a woman whose daughter you knew was alive that in fact her daughter was dead. Evil. If the town knows this, you are finished. And Bulstrode, unsurprisingly, is tortured by this thought and by this man, this drunken, leering, grinning man who's going around potentially telling people this story. Bulstrode never knows and who doesn't know. He pays him off again. Raffles comes back. It's blackmail. He knows he's never ultimately going to get rid of him. The last time that Raffles comes back, Raffles is sick. He's a drunk and he's suffering from, it's not quite put in these terms, alcohol poisoning. And he comes to Bulstrode, and Bulstrode has to take care of him. And so Bulstrode faces this terrible dilemma, which is he knows his salvation lies in Raffles dying. But he can't kill him. That would be deeply unchristian. And he couldn't square that with his faith. He couldn't square it with his conscience. A really evil hypocrite would ease Raffles out of this life. Bulstrode can't do that. He has to take care of him. But he also really, really wants him to die. And Raffles is a terrible old drunk. His death maybe is coming anyway. Is there some way that it could not be accelerated but allowed to happen? Even that Bulstrode can't quite face, so he summons a doctor, of whom more in a minute. And the doctor tells him that the treatment, the only safe treatment, is not actually what the conventional medical wisdom of the time would say, which is that you should try and ease the suffering of a man in this condition by giving him opium and maybe giving him brandy. But very, very small doses of opium is his only chance. And Bulstrode commits to following this. But then Bulstrode gets tired and he lets his housekeeper take over the care of this man. And he agonizes about this. He doesn't tell her to do anything, or even particularly not to do anything. He gives her the instructions that the doctor has given. He's clear about what needs to happen. But there's a part of him that suspects that her compassion means that she will do the folk wisdom thing, which is to feel this man is really suffering. Just a few drops of opium isn't enough. A bit more opium is going to help him, because surely medical treatment means the relief of suffering. And actually, at a certain point, she comes to Bulstrode and says, "Can I have the key to the cellar?" Bulstrode does not ask her what she needs it for. He doesn't want to ask. He doesn't want to know. She wants to get some brandy out so she can relieve his suffering. And in the morning, Raffles is dead. Bulstrode hasn't killed him. At worst, this is a sin of omission. There are one or two moments he's aware he maybe could have said something or been a bit clearer. He also knows that this is the thing that he devoutly wished for. And he thinks he's got away with it. And he's got away with it by dancing along his scruples. It's not just that he believes that he's got away with it because his nemesis is dead, but he also believes he's got away with it in the sense that he will be able to square this with his sincere faith. Not least, he promises to be a better person. He promises to be more of God's instrument in the world. He promises to reinforce his conviction that he is a good man, because he's danced on the fine line that is being true to himself and this man dying. But it makes no difference, because the word is out and the town hears that the man who had this story about Bulstrode, and the story spreads, died in Bulstrode's care, at which point it doesn't matter how many scruples Bulstrode has. All of that agonizing and dancing around a moral line, one side of it, then the other side of it, never falling off it, never quite staying consistently on it, means nothing. The town knows what happened. Bulstrode killed him. It doesn't matter what Bulstrode did. The town has its own moralistic judgment. And in the end, Bulstrode is trapped. He can't escape the moralizing of the town. As a moralistic man, he is caught in his own trap, but it's not his trap. He thinks he's successfully danced his way along that fine line. The line is obliterated by public opinion, because there's nothing at that point he could do to persuade anyone of the truth. If he went and said, "I said this, I did that," it's all nuanced. It's all very fine. These are all very fine moral judgments. I'm still a good person. They wouldn't believe a word of it. He is finished. And the other person that he drags down with him is the doctor, who is the other main character in the book. Tertius, another strange Christian name, Lydgate. He's not, you might be relieved to hear, I think, a character from Nietzsche, but what he is an English version of a character from the book I talked about previously in this series, Turgenev's Fathers and Sons. Lydgate is the English Bazarov, the young medical student in Turgenev's story, The Nihilist. Lydgate's a bit older. He's not a medical student, he is a doctor, but he shares many of Bazarov's characteristics. He is a rationalist, so we don't hear much about Lydgate's faith. We don't know what he believes, but we do know he believes in science. He's an empiricist. He's an experimenter. He believes in scientific progress. He's also ambitious. He wants to discover new things. He likes experimenting, including on the human body. So he's an anatomist. He cuts up dead bodies, which makes him very suspicious in the eyes of the town. He, like Bazarov, is not particularly interested in social niceties. He's quite aloof. He thinks he's above it all. He thinks that his belief in science removes him a bit from the ridiculousness of provincial English life. So he comes across to some people as rude, particularly older people who sense that he's arrogant. He has a reputation for being arrogant. But he's also, in his way, kind-hearted. He's quite sentimental. He's not able to escape his own sentiments. So in a line that could come straight from Turgenev, George Eliot says of Dr. Lydgate that even though he cuts up the human heart in a dish, even though he studies it under the microscope, even though he treats it as just a material organ of the human body, he can't control his own heart. It doesn't matter, just as with Bazarov, it doesn't matter if you look at these things under the microscope. It will not persuade you in any way that can rescue you from the grip of love. And Lydgate, though he persuades himself that he's not in love, that he's merely engaged in a flirtation, falls for a woman in the town called Rosamond Vincy, the sister of Fred Vincy, and eventually he marries her. He's sort of trapped by his own emotions into marrying her in the sense that he's completely convinced he's not going to marry her. He's completely convinced he's in control of the emotional temperature of their relationship. And then from one minute to the next, a bit like Fairbrother in his act of goodness, he goes into a room completely convinced that he's going to break it off with her. And without fully understanding how it happened, though he rationalized it afterwards, he is so moved by her obvious sadness at the prospect that he might break it off with her, that he gets engaged to her from one minute to the next. And so he and Rosamond get married. And it's a disaster. It's the other disastrous marriage in Middlemarch. And part of the reason that Lydgate can't live the life that he wants to live, which is the life of the rational doctor, is that he feels trapped in the town. This is not mid-19th century Russia. This is early 19th century England. He is the English Bazarov, so he's not a nihilist. He's not a radical. He's not a revolutionary. At one point, George Eliot says of him that he had warmed himself on French theories. He's read the books, but he has not been scorched by them. He still wants a comfortable life, and he doesn't want to tear it all down. He doesn't want to rip up English society. He wants to do his science in a way that means he's not constrained by social convention, but he doesn't want to tear down social convention. But in the end, he discovers there is no escaping social convention. There is no way of living where you are in that world, but also removed from it. The world will get you, and the town gets him because he can't live the way he wants to live. He's a modern medical man. He believes in the latest practices. One of the things that he believes in is that the other doctors in the town are overprescribing the drugs because the drugs don't work. Don't give your patients drugs that don't work, even though that's the way you're going to make a living, because doctors make a living by selling drugs to their patients. Lydgate believes that you should do what's best for your patients, which often means actually letting the disease take its course, study it, monitor it, and help them get better. But you don't make any money from doing that. And because he's not making as much money as the other medical men in town, he gets into debt. The town also suspects his practices. Because he's an anatomist, they think of him as a body snatcher. Rumors spread that he steals corpses and cuts them up. And he's also a body snatcher because everyone knows that Rosamond is a bit beneath him socially. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about these social hierarchies. He doesn't care about provincial English caste systems. but the town cares, and they have suspicions of him because they know that behind it is probably the other kind of body snatching, a sexual lust. He can't make enough money to live the life that he wants to live, which is a life where he doesn't have to worry about what the town thinks of him. And so he gets into debt. Now, for Nietzsche, debt and morality are two sides of the same coin. Morality is a form of debt because morality is being beholden to other people. It's how human beings get trapped, just as debt is. He thinks both debt and morality have their origin in the same idea, which is guilt, the owing of things to other human beings. Lydgate discovers that debt is the moral code that traps him because he can't find a way out of it. On the one hand, he owes money to the tradesmen around town to keep his wife in the lifestyle to which she is accustomed. And he could escape it by asking a wealthier person to bail him out, but then he would be beholden to that person. And his view of himself as an independent, free-thinking man won't allow it. On the other hand, if he doesn't bail out the tradespeople, they will get their clutches into him, and his life with his wife will become unlivable. And the other problem that he discovers is that his marriage is in some ways the opposite of Dorothea and Casaubon's. Dorothea's mistake was she thought she was marrying something, but actually she married nothing. Lydgate's mistake is he thought he was marrying nothing. That is, he thought he was marrying a woman with no real personality of her own. She was beautiful. She is beautiful. She is charming. She makes him happy. He clearly has a strong sexual attraction to her, but he thinks that she will support him in the life that he wants to lead, which is as a man of science and a man of medicine. And he discovers that she is something. She has a will. She has a will of her own, and it is powerful. It is strong, and she can marshal it effectively. She keeps defeating him in argument when he says, we've got to cut back. We mustn't do this. We mustn't do that. She just outwills him. She is in some ways a stronger person than he is. He had misunderstood her. He thought her will would be subservient to his, and he discovers that you never know with human beings whose will serve whose, and his ends up being subservient to hers. She will not cut back, and so he's trapped, and there is no escape. His life starts to close in on him. It becomes nightmarish, and his and Rosamond's arguments are hellish. They're the opposite in a way of Dorothea and Casaubon's arguments, which are all silence. He and Rosamond really say things to each other, hurtful things, brutal things. Rosamond is the one who remains in control. He is the one who loses his temper. And every time he loses his temper, he gives her more power over him. In the end, there's only one escape. He's going to have to borrow money from Bulstrode. And it's almost the only thing that he can square with his conscience, because one of the reasons he's in debt is he's working very hard in Bulstrode's hospital and he's not being paid for it. Because he is, in his own mind, a man of science and he follows the science. The hospital is where the action is. He's probably looking forward to the cholera outbreak. A lot of people to study. And he tells himself that he can just about, in good conscience, in his own terms, borrow money from Bulstrode because it's a sort of down payment for the work he's already done. It's convoluted and he doesn't really believe it. And in the act of asking Bulstrode for the money, he can hear in his own words that he's already abandoned all of the things that he thought about himself in order to beg to this man. And Bulstrode says no. Bulstrode, being Bulstrode, even though this is at the moment that Bulstrode is suffering his own agonies because Raffles is back and won't die, Bulstrode says to him, just go bankrupt. You've got to take the consequences of your action. I believe that people live and die by the consequences of what they do. There is no escape for you. The reason that they meet each other is that Bulstrode has summoned Lydgate to care for Raffles. The second time that Lydgate comes, Bulstrode changes his mind and decides that actually he will lend Lydgate £1,000. And he can't articulate to himself why he's changed his mind, but deep down he knows, not because he wants Lydgate to kill him. He is going to follow Lydgate's advice, but because he wants to be sure that Lydgate was there so that Lydgate provides a kind of cover for him should the worst happen and should Raffles die. Lydgate takes the money. Lydgate thinks that he's saved. He goes home believing he's found his salvation, that he can square with his conscience. Bulstrode thinks that he's saved. When Raffles dies, he thinks an event has happened that he didn't engineer, he didn't will it. He might have wished it, but he didn't will it, and he can square it with his conscience. And they're both wrong. When the town hears, the town doesn't just know that Bulstrode killed Raffles. The town knows that Lydgate agreed to cover it up in return for £1,000. Both men are destroyed in the eyes of the town. There is no saving Bulstrode, though his wife stands by him. He has to leave. But there is saving Lydgate. And at the end of the book, Lydgate is saved. And he's saved by the other act of moral heroism in this novel, which is performed by Dorothea. The plot is complicated, but essentially, by this point, Dorothea and Will know that they love each other, but they can't articulate it. And in the meantime, Dorothea has come to believe that actually Will is having a relationship of some kind with Lydgate's wife, Rosamond. Lydgate is ruined. The only thing that can save Lydgate is if some prominent members of the community stand up for him and let it be known that they believe him, that they believe that he did do nothing wrong, that he didn't take the money in order to cover up a crime, that it was a genuine act, both the lending of the money and the receiving of the money. And Dorothea does believe him because she's a good-hearted person and she believes in people unless she has reason otherwise. The person that she has to persuade that she believes is Rosamond, and so she goes to see Rosamond to tell her that she will stand by her husband, even though at this point she believes that Rosamond is the person who has the heart of the man that she loves. And it costs her the act of going to see Rosamond because she is consumed, though she can't articulate it to herself, by sexual jealousy and by a kind of rage. But it's heroic. She goes to see Rosamond and she forces herself to do the right thing, which is to tell Rosamond that she will stand by her and her husband. She will not drive them out of town. She will not allow them to be ruined. She will rescue them. And it turns out that by doing that, she rescues herself. So this act of moral heroism is one in which virtue gets its reward, because by saving Rosamond, Rosamond saves her. In return, Rosamond tells her that there is nothing going on between her and Will, that Will loves her. And so Will and Dorothea get married, and they forego Casaubon's money, and they lead a different kind of life. And for many people, I think the end of Middlemarch is probably too much. It's too neat, for sure. If he got that far, it would be too much for Nietzsche. This is where virtue gets its reward, where the good triumph, where the loose ends are tied up so that the couples end up married. And actually, none of the marriages break apart. Even Bulstrode's marriage holds together. His wife forgives him. She stands by him. Rosamond and Lydgate remain together. Lydgate is saved. He is not ruined. Dorothea gets to marry Will. Fred and Mary get to marry each other. All the loose ends are tied up, and all the loose couples are tied up. And for some readers, it feels a bit like George Eliot acting in place of God has engineered her universe so that it has, if not a moralistic or a moralizing, then at least a moral ending. There is a kind of moral here that the good does out in the end. But if you read right the way to the end of the book, it's harder to sustain that because there is a final chapter which tells you what happened to these couples. Lydgate is not happy. Lydgate and Rosamond's marriage is never repaired. Lydgate's salvation is also his ruin. He has to become a fashionable society doctor. He gives up on the medicine as a symbol of how little he's lived up to his own dreams. He ends up publishing a treatise on gout, which is symbolic of the fact he is now actually working for the rich people, thought to be a rich person's disease. He and Rosamond have children. He's not happy. He dies young. He's ruined. He's saved, but he's ruined. Dorothea and Will are happy, we're told, but Dorothea never gets the promise that she starts the book with, which is a will of her own. She gets a Will, a husband called Will, but she has to live through him. He becomes an MP. He becomes a reforming MP, and she has to lead the life of a wife. She does good as a wife. She ends up with a limited horizon in which the good that she can do in the world is not what she dreamed of at the beginning, which is the vast open sea of the creative human intellect. It is being a good wife to a decent man. Some readers also find at the end of the book that they tire of the thought that George Eliot has created a whole world that she rules over like a kind of benign dictator. She does appear like God in this book. She is all-seeing. She is omniscient. She's constantly intervening in the narrative to tell you things about the characters that feel like they are the insights of a kind of deity. She understands these characters so well, it's hard not to feel that she must be manipulating them in some way. It feels so true, it must be fake. I have no problem with that. If God is dead, I'm happy for George Eliot to be God. I have no problem with her omniscience. At the end of this book, I felt like I had read about a world, a set of human relationships that were fully understood by the person who created them. And there is no other way to experience that. I don't think I'm ever going to get such insight into human relationships without the help of the omniscient George Eliot. But the last thing I want to say about this book is that in the end, I don't think it is a book that can be characterized just in the language of morality, or even actually in the language of power. A lot of it is about power and morality. But when you finish it, it's tempting to take away the idea that what it's really about is light, about how human beings see things and the light by which they see things, not in a religious sense, but almost in a physical sense. The dominating motif of the book, the images that appear most often right the way through it, are images of light and seeing and vision, lamps and half-lights and coloured lights and bright lights, some extraordinary images. There's a point in Dorothea's honeymoon, her nightmarish honeymoon in Rome, in Catholic Rome, where she's in a church and surrounded by the red that is everywhere, the red fabric that is everywhere. And George Eliot describes it like blood. She says it's like a disease of the retina, all this red. Eyes, vision, light. And by the end of the book, I can only speak for myself, it feels like reading about a series of characters, each of whom exists in their own box of light, in the sense that you see the world as they see it looking out, looking through some kind of prism that when you see it from the outside, you can see the ways in which what they see is shaped almost by the bubble that's around them. It's transparent to them, but it's still a box. They're inside something which limits or frames how they see the world. But they can't see it because they are seeing through it. It is see-through, this box. But George Eliot helps us see it from the outside. We can see the way in which every human being's view of the whole world is shaped by the prism through which they see it. And then she shows us what happens when these boxes of light, these people, interact with each other. Sometimes when they come together, they see more. They can see through the other person's prism into a wider vision. Sometimes, as when Dorothea and Casaubon come together, it suddenly shrinks. She thinks she's going to see the world, and she ends up seeing almost nothing. And the imagery is mainly of seeing and not seeing. Sometimes the other person limits what can be seen. Sometimes when the two people come together, like Lydgate and Rosamond, what they can see is the edge of their own vision. Suddenly they notice they're in a box. They're in a little room of light. There isn't any seeing out of it. It becomes opaque. And then behind it all, George Eliot is showing us this community, this provincial town and the land around it and the people who live on the land and the interactions between them. And that's also inside some kind of prism. It's like a dome. It's like that Stephen King novel where they put a dome over a town. But this one isn't hard. People see through it. We see through it from the outside in, and the people in see through it from the inside out. There is no hard edge to any of these boxes of light, but they are boxes, they are domes. And even inside Middlemarch, all the stuff that's going on around the edges, the reform and the disease and the loss of faith and the railways are going to cut through all of this. And yet to see it from the outside is to get a sense of the people seeing it from the inside are not seeing the whole thing. So George Eliot is all-seeing in some ways, but she's not all-seeing because this is a novel of enlightenment. That's what it's not. It's about light, but it is not a novel of enlightenment. This is not a novel of enlightened progress. The 40-year gap between 1832 and 1872 is not a straightforward story of enlightenment. She mocks that idea. That is one of the things she's mocking, that the 40-year-on people see more. They don't see more. What she does is she helps them see through. She helps them see through the dome, whatever it is, the prism that lays over Middlemarch, and in seeing through it to the people inside, and therefore seeing how they see the world from the inside out, she doesn't allow us to judge them, to think that we know better than them. She allows us to suspect that this is how we should see ourselves. We're also not seeing the world as it is. To see ourselves from the outside would also be to see that what we see from the inside is not the whole world. It's just our version of it, and our version of it is not everything. To find out more about this series and this podcast, just visit our new website, ppfideas.com. Next, in 15 Fictions for Summer, I'm talking about Anthony Trollope's brilliant novel of parliamentary hijinks, Phineas Redux.